This is Dreaming of His Kiss, Part 2. A Cowboy Mountain Christmas Small Town Sweet Romance. Written by Jesse Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Chapter 6. Sunday morning when Penny walked into church, attendance went up by a fifth. She recognized Pastor Dunkel, his wife, and of course Race. The young man with him must be Ethan, the slightly troubled 20-something whom she'd heard was living with him and helping him on the farm. There was a couple that she didn't know. Then herself. That was it. It was hard to believe that Race had left a successful and prestigious position as a cardiac surgeon for this. Race had an excellent message, though, which made her even more sad, because there should have been people in there to hear it. She waited in the back after the service was over and Pastor Dunkel's wife finished up playing the piano. Ethan nodded at her and walked out first. The other couple shook Race's hand and left shortly after. Pastor and Mrs. Dunkel shook hers along with Race's and spoke to him a few minutes before walking out. She leaned against the back pew as he gathered up his papers and Bible and walked toward her. "Most of the time, we have a couple kids. Obviously, they didn't come today." "I noticed they weren't here." She pressed her lips together, trying to keep from smiling. "You can laugh at me. It's okay." "I wasn't laughing at you. I guess I was laughing at what you'd said. Obviously, they weren't here." It did make her wonder what he'd been expecting from her, since the position he'd asked her to fill was helping with the kids. Except there were no kids. He smiled, but it wasn't hard to see the sadness, or maybe it was disappointment, in his eyes. She wanted to fix that, but really, what was she going to do, other than what she was doing? "I invited the kids next door to my house, and they couldn't come today, but they said they'd come next week. I'll be bringing them myself." He nodded. "Normally I pick some kids up, but they weren't going to be home this weekend either." His mouth flattened, and he looked away. Despite herself, Penny's heart hurt for him. When he'd talked to her in the car, she'd realized that maybe all the blame hadn't been his. That rather than suffering in silence, waiting and hoping that he'd finally notice her, she should have spoken up and told him what she wanted and what she wasn't getting that she needed. She should have given him a warning that she was getting ready to walk. He'd said he hadn't had a clue, and she believed him. She also had been able to tell, quite clearly, that her leaving had hurt him. Up until that point, she'd thought he hadn't cared and probably hadn't even noticed. Now, Race looked about as dejected as he had yesterday. He wasn't used to not being successful. She supposed it was probably good for him, but it was still hard to watch. He seemed to shake it off as he straightened and his eyes focused on her again. "Would you like to go down to the Mistletoe Madhouse to get a hot dog?" If Penny didn't know him so well, she wouldn't have noticed the way his thumb flipped back and forth along the edge of one of the papers that stuck out of his Bible. As a man whose hands were rock steady, that little tell with his thumb spoke volumes about his nervousness. For some reason, it made her feel good that he was nervous about asking her out. Was that what this was? It definitely made it easier for her to say yes. It wasn't like she wanted to go back to her empty house and face the entire Sunday afternoon alone. "Sure, I'd love to." She found it was true. There'd never been anyone else in her life that she had enjoyed spending time with as much as Race. His lips pulled back, and he moved to swing his arm, allowing her to go first. But then he stopped. "If you want to drive, you can." She laughed, and the sound echoed through the church. She wasn't sure when the last time was she'd actually laughed out loud, and it wasn't even that it was so funny. It was just the way he said it. It reminded her of the conversation that they'd had. "No, that's okay. You go right ahead." "I suppose if I insist that you drive, that's me controlling again?" "That's right." "So this is a no-win situation for me." "Right again," she said with a smirk. "Maybe we should just walk. I might be able to come out the winner in that situation somehow." "You know, it's not a competition," she said before shrugging. "That's fine. It's not that cold out today." "I know it's not. I guess my competitive streak is alive and well." She lifted a brow. She'd never been intimidated or upset with Race needing to be the best. It was different than her laid-backness, but not in a bad way. Deciding to ignore it, she went back to the weather. "It's actually nice out for December." "It is. Not too cold." He stopped at the door and looked back into the sanctuary. "You did a really nice job of decorating. You must have done that last night." "Yeah, Pastor Dunkel let me in." "Give me your receipts and I'll reimburse you for what you spent." "No, it's a donation." She didn't have any children, and the only expenses she had were her house and utilities. She'd saved a little bit for retirement, and the rest she felt she could give away. She wasn't going to tell him that decorating the church was a part of that. His eyes narrowed slightly, and she knew he didn't like her answer, but what was he going to do about it? Force her to take money? She couldn't do that to him. She'd signed on to help him. She needed to pull her share. Technically, she'd signed on to help with children, of which there were none. "I'm sorry you studied the lesson but didn't use it today," he said as they walked out of the church and down the sidewalk. "It was a lesson I needed, so it wasn't a waste of time." She looked down at the cracked sidewalk and took a breath. "Your message was really good today. I wish more people could have heard it. It definitely was a blessing to me." He took 2 steps before he said softly and almost with wonder in his voice, "Really? It was okay?" "It was more than okay. It was really good." This time she looked up and met his eyes. She gave a little smile, and his face lit up in a grin, like he wasn't a world-renowned surgeon and actually needed and appreciated her compliment. "You sound sure about that, but you also sound surprised." He was still grinning, even though he was facing forward again. "Back when I knew you, I would never have thought that you would be giving a sermon. But at the same time, everything you do, I expect you'll do well. That's just the way you are." He touched her arm and stopped. She stopped with him. He leaned closer, and she was mesmerized, unable to back up, not wanting to anyway. "There are a lot of things about me that are different than what they were when you and I were together." Her mouth was open, but she didn't have the presence of mind to shut it. Finally, she breathed out, "Me too." They stood staring at each other. Someone walked around them on the sidewalk. A car motored down the street, but she barely noticed and certainly didn't look at any of it. Normally, she would have waved at the car and smiled at the person, whether she knew them or not. But her mind wasn't functioning in normal mode. She wasn't sure what would have happened, but his phone rang, breaking the spell that had fallen between them. With a tightening of his jaw, he reached back and pulled his phone out. "Excuse me for a moment?" She shrugged and backed up a step. "Sure." He watched that step with lowered eyes, almost disapproving, before swiping his phone. "Hello?" She waded through the conversation, taking another step back and looking out along the ridges of mountains. The Ozarks were beautiful any time of year, but she wasn't really seeing them. What was going on? She knew there was still an attraction between them. She'd felt that before. But she certainly wasn't going to do anything about it. She'd already been down this road, and one thing about getting older was that she hopefully got wiser. Wise enough to not make the same stupid mistakes twice. That was the hope, anyway. She kicked cobblestones off the cement sidewalk before waving at the car that drove slowly up the street and trying to pretend her stomach wasn't growling and her heart wasn't begging her to consider giving Race another chance. Finally, he swiped off his phone and shoved it in his pocket. Sorry about that. Pastor Dunkel gave Child Services my number. They have a family of 6 teenagers who are looking to be placed in a home together. You don't know of anyone who wants 6 teenagers, do you? He asked, almost sarcastically, like he knew the odds were impossible as they started walking again. No. She shook her head, wishing her circumstances were different. All the kids wanted was to keep the family they had left, the 6 of them, intact. I've heard about them. They're pretty determined to be together, but no one wants teenagers, let alone 6. Actually, I think there are a couple ones that haven't hit the teen years yet. Yeah, his face scrunched up. 10, 12, 13, 14, 16, and 17, if I remember correctly. He blew out a breath and shook his head. Sheesh, that's a lot of kids. I hope someone takes them. It would be awful to be separated. Yeah, especially after losing your parents. But still, you have to find a pretty special couple who would take on that kind of responsibility. They made it to the Mistletoe Madhouse and managed to sit down and have a meal together without arguing. Although she supposed that what they had been doing in the car was just hashing things out that should have been hashed out a long time ago, and coming to the conclusion that maybe no one was to blame, or they both were. It was good to hear his side of the story anyway. It had definitely made her understand things a little better. He'd been hurt too. But as she drove away from the church when they were finished eating and had walked back, she decided that maybe they had become friends. She thought that she liked that. Chapter 7. I got a tree for the church. Race hit send on his phone. He stared at the message he'd just sent. There was no invitation there. That wasn't what he meant. He typed some more. Would you come help me decorate it? There, that was what he wanted. It was Wednesday, and he hadn't seen Penny since Sunday. It felt like forever. He was in his mid-50s. He was way too old to be mooning over a woman, even if it was his ex-wife, even if she was the kind of woman that deserved to be mooned over. He berated himself 1,000 times for the mistakes of his youth, but there was no point in looking back, no point being upset about it, if he didn't fix them. If he wanted another chance, she needed him to spend time with her. That's what she'd wanted back when they were married. If he had the opportunity again, he wasn't going to let it go. Now? Sure, if you're off work. It was after 5, and she said she got off at 3. So, unless she was delivering a baby, she should be free. Or she might have other things she was doing. He'd never thought to ask her about that. Have you eaten? Yes. Let me finish and I'll be right there. He hadn't even thought about whether or not she'd eaten supper. He should have been more considerate. He could have offered to take her to eat first. Consideration wasn't natural to him, but neither was heart surgery. He'd had to practice and get good. Learning to be considerate and to think of Penny's feelings couldn't be harder than learning to be a heart surgeon. With his hands on his hips, He surveyed the tree that he'd managed to get in and set in the stand. He could have brought a much bigger one in, because the ceilings were high in the old church, but he hadn't thought he could manhandle something bigger, and Ethan was working late tonight. He rubbed his hands down his jeans. Why was he so nervous? It was his ex-wife. He knew her as well as anyone. Except that was a long time ago. He didn't know her at all now. He was unwilling to question his motives too much. Did he want her back? Was he trying to win her affection and possibly her love? All that felt like a losing battle and made his insides clamor and twist, so he put his hands on his hips and tried to determine whether or not the tree was straight. 15 minutes later, the door to the church opened as he was still trying to adjust the holders on the stand. "Hold up right there, please," he called from his position, squatting in front of the tree with his arm buried in prickly branches. "Is it straight?" Without letting go, he turned his head, brushing a sharp pine needle, and looked across the pews to where she stood in the back. Her hair was in a ponytail. She wore a loose sweater and jeans. Casual, but her cheeks glowed and her eyes sparkled, and she shone with an inner radiance that very few people achieved. She'd left him, and she'd become better for it. "A little more to the left, I think," she said, her head tilted to the side. He shifted the tree. "Better?" "A little more." "How about now?" "Just another half an inch." He shifted the tree again. Pine needles brushed his face and fell to the carpet. "And now?" "Too far." It took 20 minutes before they got the tree straight, according to Penny specs. He might have been a little frustrated, but he knew she had an eye that he didn't for decorating. He trusted her taste and discretion. She finally declared it good, and he'd crawled up off the floor. "All of the decorations are back here in this closet." He brushed his hands off and walked to the back of the church, going into the vestibule. The closet there wasn't huge, but Pastor Dunkel had assured him that there were enough ornaments to decorate a large tree, so there should be plenty to do the small tree that he'd gotten. "I have no idea what's in here," he said. He'd managed to walk down the aisle with her without grabbing her hand, just like he'd managed to walk to the diner with her on Sunday without holding it either. But it felt so natural to want to take it in his, and that was what he wanted to do. He didn't think she was ready for that. Maybe she never would be. Penny knelt beside him and reached for a box, pulling it out of the small closet and opening it. "These are purple. Pretty." She set it aside and reached for another one. "More purple." "Pastor Dunkel didn't tell me what color they were." She didn't seem upset with the colors. When they were married, she'd always been decorating something or other, and he had to admit he'd never paid that much attention to her. "I'd kind of like to open them all so we can decide what we want to use and what we want to keep back. It looks like there's going to be more than enough to trim that tree." It didn't take long for them to pull the boxes out and for Penny to sort them according to colors. Race tried to help but felt a little extraneous as she gathered up what she wanted. When she had everything, he put the rest away, and they walked back into the sanctuary. She set the boxes down and started getting the ornaments out. Pointing to the tree, she explained how she wanted them placed. It was a relief to him that she just told him what to do, since this was definitely an area where he didn't have a clue. They worked in silence for a few minutes before she spoke. "You know, I've been thinking about what you want me to do with the kids." "Yeah?" he asked. Was she going to quit? She seemed to be gathering her thoughts, like she was going to try to talk him into something. What in the world could it be? "Well, I think we need to plan like there's going to be kids here. I'm saying let's have a whole theme for the rest of December. It won't be anything fancy, since we don't have time to prepare. We only have 3 Sundays, but let's have a Christmas party on one of them. Even if only one kid shows up, we're doing something. And that one kid who shows up will enjoy themselves and come back." He had to admit she was right. It was always a good strategy to plan for what you hoped for. "Sure. Great idea. I'm game for that." "And I think we need to have things going on in January. Not just for the kids, but for the whole church. Why not? I mean, yes, it's a lot of work to go through even if only a few people show up, but it's our job. It's what we do." He could see what she was saying, and he agreed. He hadn't quite thought about it like that. He'd been kind of waiting until they got people, and then he'd start to plan things. But it made sense. Just plan like there's going to be people there, and have faith that they would show up. For the next hour while they decorated the tree, they made plans for January and February, including a couples banquet for Valentine's Day and an indoor winter festival for the children in February. Penny had a way of infusing excitement into her ideas, and by the time they were done talking and ready to put the star on the tree, he was pretty pumped about all the things that would be going on in their church for the next 3 months. Almost so excited that he'd forgotten that now they had a lot of plans, but there still weren't any people coming. "Here," she said, handing him the star. "Can you reach the top?" He reached for the star, his fingers brushing hers, which was a mistake. Shockwaves flew up his arm as his eyes flew up, looking at her face. Her eyes were glued to the star like it held all the answers. He swallowed, loud in the silence of the sanctuary. This wasn't the time for him to move forward with her, although that's what he wanted to do. Close the distance and touch her like he used to have the right to, running his hand over her cheek and around the back of her neck. In all the years that he'd done surgery, his hands had always been rock steady, and right now was no exception. But his knees shook, maybe with the need to move closer, more than anything else, but he resisted the urge. Her fingers pulled stiffly off the star, like it was a deliberate effort on her part, and she turned away on the pretense of walking several steps and turning around, looking at the tree. He felt wobbly and disconcerted. Obviously, she didn't welcome his touch since she walked away. That was probably deep disappointment that was scalding the inside of his chest. Race pushed the irritating feeling aside and took a step toward the tree, reaching out. The top wasn't that far, and if he stretched just so... His legs still weren't steady, and he lost his balance as he stretched out. He tried to jerk to the right as he fell forward. He did almost miss the tree, but his leg gave out and he ended up almost head diving into it. The tree crashed to the floor a second before he landed on top of it. Inglorious. That's exactly how he felt. Penny knelt beside him, almost before he hit the ground. "Are you okay?" He wasn't even dazed. "Everything's fine, except my ego." "Are you sure? That was some fall." "Go big or go home." His lips twitched. She laughed as he'd intended. "I don't know, Race. I would think a world-renowned surgeon could get the star placed on top of the Christmas tree. That's not exactly a precision move." "Next time, I'll let you do it." "If I were doing it, I would get a ladder." "I really thought I could do it without one." That was his first mistake, although he really felt he could have done it without one if he'd waited a little longer to get himself together after looking at Penny. It probably wouldn't do to say that, though. On the other hand, why not? "You just have me all worked up because of that sultry way you blink your eyes at me." He rolled off the tree and sat up. She really did blink her eyes, like 7 or 8 times, and then shook her head. "What? I didn't do any sultry look." "You sure did." Got me all worked up. My knees were shaking so bad I couldn't keep my balance.
So you're blaming me for this?
She spread her arm, indicating the tree resting on the hardwood floor and the ornaments that were scattered everywhere. I sure am. That sultry look would do this to any man. He held his hands up, indicating his position on the floor by the downed tree. You're dangerous with those.
And you're nuts. I couldn't do sultry if I tried.
She was probably right about that. She was a fresh-faced, girl-next-door kind of girl, not a siren. She wasn't the type to cheat like his second wife, either. She was just content and happy, and sweet and nice. She'd been his biggest supporter, and he'd taken that for granted. Taken it like she'd always be there, and it didn't matter if he returned anything that she gave him.
You seemed okay there for a bit, but now you're not looking so good. Is everything okay?
Penny leaned in a little closer, like there might be something on his face that would clue her in as to what any problem was. No, I'm fine. But then he realized she was leaning closer. That could be a good thing. He shifted. Oh, on the other hand, yeah. She spun on her knees and looked back at him.
What? Are you okay?
Well, when I move, he picked his hand up off the floor a little bit.
Yeah? What is it?
She leaned closer. My shoulder feels a little weird. It was actually his chest that felt weird, and not because of the fall. Pretty sad that an accomplished surgeon was using junior high tricks to try to get closer to the girl. Her hand came up and hovered for a second before it landed lightly on his left shoulder. No, not that one, the other one. Guilt tightened the back of his throat. There was nothing wrong with the shoulder, nothing at all. But her hand moved from his left shoulder to his right shoulder, and she pressed on it gently.
Here?
Not exactly.
Can you move your fingers?
She asked, still gently touching his shoulder. He lifted his arm up and wiggled his fingers, slowly, just so she wouldn't know for sure that there wasn't anything wrong.
And that doesn't hurt? She asked.
No, not at all.
Where exactly did it hurt?
She asked, her brows drawn in, her eyes roving over his shoulder and down his arm. He'd like to keep on hedging, but he just had never been good at subterfuge. Yeah, he had a lot of faults, but lying had never been one of them. I have a confession to make, he said softly, breathing deeply of her peppermint and vanilla scent. It was at once new and familiar, and elicited a longing in his soul that was stronger than anything he'd ever felt. Her eyes shot to his, her hand tightened on his shoulder. Her mouth opened in an O before she said,
You're really hurt, aren't you? And you're trying to pretend you're not. Maybe I deliver babies, but I can handle emergency trauma.
His head shook back and forth. The guilt that had been a small pinch now ballooned in his chest. He lowered his eyes. No, I'm not hurt at all. I just wanted you to be closer. I wanted to enjoy just being near you for a minute. I feel like I'm about 12. It was true. Everything he'd been doing for the last few minutes was something a junior high kid would do, not a 50-something heart surgeon. Her hand jerked on his shoulder. He was gratified she didn't take it away.
So, let me get this straight. You're not hurt at all. You were faking it?
Her eyes were level with his. He remembered that beautiful emerald green. Even her position, with her hand on the shoulder and her body over his, brought back memories that he tried to push away. A whisper and a smile, the soft touch of her skin, and the slide of her hair through his hands. It was all there, right on the edge of his brain, teasing him.
Race?
There was concern in her voice again. Yeah, I was faking it because I wanted to be close to you. Again.
We tried us once. It didn't work.
Her voice wasn't as strong as before. We were young, and I was stupid. I think we should give ourselves another chance. He couldn't keep the pleading out of his voice. Give me another chance. For a dozen or so heartbeats, she stared at him, her lips parted and her breath going in and out, just as fast as his. Finally, she shook her head, dropped her hand, and got up. Ignoring him, she put her hands on her hips and looked at the tree.
I think we can stand it up and salvage most of it. We just have to get it straight again.
She wasn't going to acknowledge the attraction that flared between them, the history, the idea that they could be together once more. Obviously, she was set on denying that she felt anything and ignoring the fact that he did. He couldn't blame her. Some men didn't even get one chance at a lifetime love. He couldn't expect two. Things were stilted between them as they picked the tree up, but by the time they got it straightened again and started picking the decorations off the floor, they'd fallen back into a partnership of sorts, even if it wasn't the easy camaraderie they'd shared before. This time, when he put the star on, she didn't allow his fingers to brush her hand. He took it without comment. After he put it on, without incident, they both stood back, admiring. I don't know how you do it, the way you put the colors together, but it just looks perfectly symmetrical and astoundingly beautiful. Her smile was pleased, and he was happy that he could put it there.
Thank you,
she said, and there was no stiltedness in her tone. They stood for a few more seconds before he said, How about we go for hot chocolate to celebrate? She hesitated. Finally, she blew out a breath.
I'll be honest with you, Race. The attraction that I feel for you is the exact same attraction that I felt for you back when we were in our 20s. But I'm scared. There was a lot of pain involved with the relationship that you and I had. And I have absolutely no desire, am, in fact, afraid, to go through that again.
She admitted attraction. She was talking about a relationship. He saw those things as good signs. He hoped he wasn't pushing too hard. I can promise you this time will be a lot different than the last. She pulled both of her lips in and stood chewing on them. Worry lines deepened between her brows. He touched her hand with his before taking it and threading their fingers together. She didn't resist. He thought she might be wavering as he brought her hand up to his mouth and kissed a knuckle. Try me, please. Her eyes stayed on the tree before she turned to look at him.
I'll try you long enough for you to buy me hot chocolate. How will that be? After that, we'll go from there.
Fair enough. His smile was genuine. He knew he was right. He had every intention in the world of doing things completely different this time than he had the last. He wouldn't waste his chance to prove it. Chapter 8. 2 weeks later.
That was a big change. We had 20 children in junior church.
Penny smiled up at Race, who had his Bible and iPad under one arm and was reaching out to take the bag that she carried with her children's church stuff in it. That many? That's great. He shifted his things and grabbed her bag. I know that's all because of you and the work that you put into spreading the word and inviting people. Also because of the plans that you made and your idea of deciding to do things regardless of whether or not there were people here. You were right. People came. His smile was relieved and happy. Her heart warmed. Working with Race for the last 2 weeks had been amazing. In fact, she normally loved her day job, loved talking to ladies who were expecting, loved the excitement and expectation of welcoming a new child into a family. But she had been looking forward every day to getting off work so she could come to the church and be with Race. He'd definitely been making her heart happy. It wasn't just working with him, though. It was being with him, chatting and feeling that companionable camaraderie that one felt with a very good friend. There was also that attraction that sizzled between them. It added excitement to her day, and she found herself accidentally brushing him with her fingers, over his shoulder or on his arm, or touching his hand with hers. She supposed love was the same, and it didn't matter what one's age was. No, not love, attraction. She couldn't think love. That was too much risk. Attraction was the same at any age. She just wanted to be with him and be close to him. "How do you feel about going to the diner for lunch?" Race asked as his fingers brushed her arm as he held his arm out, allowing her to go down the aisle first. Used to the sparks by now, her eyes still shot to his, which twinkled down at her. He'd done it on purpose. He was just as guilty as she was of accidentally brushing her at times. They'd kind of been dancing around each other, and her defenses had been coming down.
I'd love to.
It was the honest truth. Race really did seem to be different. He'd been attentive and considerate. He was still controlling, and he hadn't been completely perfect, but neither had she. She wasn't looking for perfection. She just wanted an honest effort. Race had definitely been putting in an honest effort. The weather had trended more cool, but the temperatures today were well above average. "Do you want to walk?" Race asked as they stopped at her car so she could put her things away.
I'd love to. It's a beautiful day for a walk.
He kept walking to his own vehicle and put his things inside. She met him there, and they walked side by side through the parking lot to the sidewalk. Their hands brushed once. She smiled to herself. With the next step, she stretched her fingers out and took his hand. Their fingers slipped together like they hadn't been apart for 20 years. It felt right, natural. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see him looking down at her, so she looked up, unable to keep the grin off her face. He smiled too. Words seemed to pass between them without them saying anything. Their look spoke of trust and companionship, of loyalty and dependability. He'd convinced her that he truly had changed, and for the better. Race wasn't the kind of guy who could pretend or deceive. She believed him. She thought he probably saw all of that on her face, and she saw determination on his. Determination, she assumed, not to make the same mistake again. Neither would she. She wasn't going to give up on him. He was right. He was worth fighting for. His phone buzzed as they walked into the diner. "Do you mind if I get this?"
No, go right ahead.
The words were barely out of her mouth when her own phone rang out from her purse. She laughed.
Mine's ringing too.
Hopefully it wasn't a call from the hospital. Things had been pretty quiet lately, but she did have 2 patients who could go into labor at any time. They walked to their normal booth and sat down as he answered his phone. She swiped her phone.
Hello?
Hello, it's Nancy Martin.
I saw you in church today, Nancy. Thanks for bringing your grandchildren.
They loved it and are begging to go back, but that's not why I called.
Good. Okay.
I wanted to talk to you at church before I left, but I needed to get them home. They were starving and needed naps.
I totally understand.
Penny didn't really understand, and she knew it. She'd never had children that needed to get home and fed and napped after church, but she did understand the need to leave.
Is there a problem? She asked.
Race's voice came across the table. He said something about not having found anyone. She wasn't sure exactly what he was talking about and was distracted with Nancy's next question.
Remember the 6 children I told you about? The ones that were fighting to stay together and were hoping for a family to adopt them or at least foster them all?
Yes?
Well, they're getting really desperate. I was just wondering if you had thought of anyone or had any leads or anything. The state has already separated them, and one of the children just got out of juvie for drugs. Another one is clear up in the north of the eastern part of the state with a family that she's run away from twice, trying to get back to her siblings. They're threatening to put her in juvie, too. Is there any way you can help?
Penny tapped her fingers on the table. She'd made a few inquiries, but she hadn't been as diligent about it as she could have been. She would be sure to try harder.
I'm sorry, it's just so hard to find anyone who's willing. 1 or 2 children, especially the younger children, are a probable yes. But 6, and mostly teens? One lady just laughed at me. I'll keep looking, though.
She had no idea who else she could ask. She'd exhausted everyone that she knew might possibly be interested.
I'd appreciate it. It's kind of an emergency. The family's falling apart.
I'll do what I can.
Thank you.
Penny slowly lowered her phone, swiping off. The day that had looked so bright and sweet as she'd walked hand in hand with Race now looked dark and gloomy. Even the sparkly candy canes hanging from the ceiling in the diner and the Christmas music blaring out of the speakers couldn't keep the darkness from settling. It might have made it worse. Her heart went out to those children who were longing for a home. How awful, especially at this time of year. If those parents could see the kids now, they would be crying, she was sure. What's the problem? Race's voice came across the table, full of concern. His hand reached out to the middle, palm up, and she didn't hesitate. She moved her hand over and slid it into his. The attraction was there, it always was, but there was also peace and comfort that just felt right.
I told you about the 6 children who were looking to find a foster home that would take them all.
If you didn't, someone else did. In fact, that was what my call was about.
Really?
Penny's eyes got wide and her brows furrowed as she stared at him.
You just got a call about them?
Yeah, that was Pastor Dunkel, saying that he meant to say something to me in church today, that he had heard that some of those kids were having issues and they really needed to be placed, soon. He asked if I'd found anyone. I was going to ask you if you knew of anyone, because the few people that I know have already said no. I've even hit up doctors and other hospital staff that I know in Chicago and asked them to spread the word. Nothing. No one wants teenagers, and no one wants 6 kids. He shook his head, and her hand squeezed his. I just feel compelled to help them. I've already spent more time on the phone looking for someone willing to take them than I should have. I just can't find anyone. Penny tapped her fingers on the table as Race's thumb slid over her hand.
That was Nancy Martin on the phone for me. She was saying the exact same thing, that they were in trouble and needed to be placed as soon as possible in a good home.
What were the odds of them getting phone calls like that, and at the same time? Their eyes met over the table. Neither one of them believed in coincidence. Penny sighed.
It doesn't help that one of them is just getting out of juvie, I'm sure.
Yeah, Pastor Dunkel mentioned that too. I don't think it's anything serious, not like he's going to shoot someone in their sleep, but a troubled teen is about impossible to place.
I would take him, Penny said fervently.
She'd never even met the children, but she loved them and wanted them to have the very best home. They'd been in her prayers for weeks now, but God didn't seem to be answering that one. Race's hand squeezed hers. I would take them too, except a single dad with 6 kids, especially a single dad like me, who isn't exactly known for being good with kids or people in general, probably wouldn't be approved as a foster parent.
You're a pastor. Of course you're good with people.
I'm learning to be good with people. It's what God wants, but I'm not a natural at it. I'm much more used to bossing people around. Plus, kids are a whole new ballgame. Teenagers. He shivered. I don't know if I could even handle one. He looked at her. Unless... She had been looking at their hands and thinking, pondering, trying to figure out if she knew anyone at all, who might be interested. She knew a lot of really great people with big hearts who did a lot for charity and gave money and volunteered. But did she know anyone who would basically give up their life? That's what it would take. But when his voice trailed off, she looked up into those eyes that were so familiar and so beloved, and it only took 2 seconds before she knew exactly what he was saying. Us? His brows lifted, a slight movement of his head. She clenched her jaw and breathed deep. How would that work? What would it look like? Could she do it?
How?
Would you marry me? Again? He wasn't down on one knee, and it wasn't a romantic proposal, but he was holding her hand, and she really didn't need anything more.
Get married just for the children?
I think you know better. He shook his head. No, I don't expect you to make assumptions. I'll tell you. His gaze was fierce. I love you. As soon as I saw you in the church, I knew I'd never stopped loving you. You feel like my soulmate, and I know you think I didn't care, and I know I neglected you, and I know you thought that it didn't matter to me. But when you walked out, you have no idea how that broke me. I'd known all along, but I hadn't realized how much I'd taken for granted. You know I'm sorry, and you know I'm not going to let it happen again. I'd wanted to take it slow, so I could prove to you that I would be here for you, that you could depend on me, that I wasn't going to neglect you, that you would be a priority. I wanted to show all of that to you, first, before I asked you to make a commitment to me again, after I'd failed so miserably the first time. He narrowed his eyes. But it feels like the Lord is saying something to us, and so maybe I'm rushing things, but I'm not unsure about the fact that I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. His words had made tears prick in her eyes, him admitting that he'd been wrong. He'd done it before, but to hear him say that he'd been devastated, and that he'd been lost without her, and that he loved her now, was amazing.
Just for the record, I love you too. I loved you when I left, and you've always been the one in my heart. And yes, I'll marry you. And yes.
She laughed.
I'll do this crazy thing and adopt 6 teenagers, because why not?
He laughed along with her. I can think of a lot of reasons why not, but I guess the big reason why is that I feel like that's what the Lord wants us to do. Penny nodded.
That's exactly my feeling as well. It's kind of crazy how he's worked all of this out.
Race took a deep breath, then blew it out. This is a pretty big decision. Do you think we ought to sleep on it?
Are you getting cold feet already?
Penny smiled because she wasn't too worried about it.
And this big decision, is that us getting married again or the 6 kids?
Yes, both. I don't know. I guess if we both feel that it's God's will, we don't need to sit around and think about it. it would be foolish for us not to do it, because we don't want to not do what God wants us to do.
I agree. Let's see what we can do to make it happen.
The waitress bustled over just then with a notepad in her hand.
I'm so sorry. Sunday lunchtime is always so crazy busy. I am so sorry I kept you waiting.
She blew her hair out of her face and lifted her pad up.
Can I take your drink orders? And I can take your food orders too if you're ready.
Race squeezed Penny's hand, and she squeezed back before they ordered. She had a feeling that they ought to enjoy this quiet time together. If everything went as they thought it was going to, it wouldn't be long before they probably wouldn't have much time for themselves. She couldn't stop the excited beating of her heart. Was God finally going to answer her lifelong prayer? Was she finally getting children of her own? Would He work everything out for them? Despite the questions running through her head, she had total peace in her heart, and she was assured that He would. Chapter 9. 3 days later. Race put an arm around Penny's shoulders. She twisted the glittering diamond on her hand, the one that they'd gone and gotten the day after he proposed. On Saturday, he'd be sliding a golden band to nestle down on her finger beside it. But for now, they were standing in the living room of his farmhouse, waiting. 2 state workers were supposed to be arriving with 6 kids any minute. This was to be a meet and greet, supposedly to help Penny and him make up their minds as to whether or not they felt sure they would be able to foster them together. The kids weren't staying, not until they went through the waiting period and gave a definite yes. Next week. This was not exactly protocol, he'd been assured, but because of the nature of the teenagers and the number of children and his inexperience, although Penny had fostered several children before and had an excellent record, the workers felt this was the best way.
Did you talk to Ethan?
Penny asked anxiously. She must have forgotten that she'd already asked that question, and he'd already answered it. No doubt she was nervous. I did. I told him he was welcome to continue living with me, or he could move to the cabin, but he said he'd think about staying. I suppose he's probably with the majority of the rest of the world, who thinks that living with 6 teenagers might be more people upsetting their nicely ordered world than what they want to have. He leaned close to her ear and said quietly, "I'm not going to hold it against you if you back out." She turned toward him and put her hands on his chest.
Of the marriage or the kids?
Her lips tilted up in that little grin that he loved. He put his hands over hers before sliding his fingers up her arms and putting his arms around her. I just realized something.
What's that?
I proposed to you, and you said yes, but I have yet to get a kiss over that. He loved seeing her face light and then lift, and the smile widen and shift until she looked like she was glowing. Man, he could look at her like that every day.
Maybe you should remedy that. Of all the things that I missed when I left, I dreamed about your kiss. I still dream about your kiss.
Really? That makes me a little nervous. Sometimes the things we think about in our head are better than actual reality.
No, the dream was every bit as good as reality, but it couldn't be better.
I'd have to take your word on that. She tilted her head.
I'm not against comparisons.
It was his turn to chuckle. Then let's do that. Her hand slid around his back, and she stepped closer into his embrace, lifting her head and looking at him with all the stars in her eyes that she had as a young girl. Only this time, he knew how precious they were, and he hoped with everything in him that he wouldn't let her down. Not with the kids, not with anything else. Is this what's called making a dream come true? He murmured. Because it feels that way to me. She nodded as he closed the distance between them, and his lips landed gently on hers, and he breathed in her scent and her air. His world shifted and clicked into place because it felt so perfect and right. He deepened the kiss, and she pressed closer, her hands tightening on him, mirroring his desire to have her closer, have more, have everything. She made a little sound and pressed even closer, tugging on the back of his neck and pressing her body to his. The front door opened, and it took about 3 seconds for that to register. They broke apart, maybe a little guilty, although he wouldn't know why. Their breathing was labored as they stood looking at each other. It was a few seconds later before she spoke.
Reality is definitely better.
One side of his mouth tilted up in a grin. I have to agree with you there. That was really romantic, but I'm here now, so maybe we could just talk, Ethan said, then shoved his hands in his pockets. He didn't seem to know what to do with his long limbs as he shifted back and forth in front of the picture window. Hey, man, glad you could make it. It's not every day a fellow gets 6 younger siblings all at one time. Figured I better come check them out, decide whether or not I'm moving out, he said with a carefree grin. Penny was pretty sure that they would have 7 kids under the roof. Ethan was 20 and hardly a child, but he didn't have a home. He might as well live with them. What was one more? There were a couple of cars pulling in the drive as I walked in. I thought that might be them, Ethan said. He no sooner got those words out of his mouth than there was a knock at the door. Ethan opened it and held it while 6 kids and 2 adults paraded in. Race's eyes were drawn to the kid who had his head shaved, except for a long strand of hair that hung down to his shoulders from his ear. He also had a big skull and crossbones earring dangling from one ear and an eyebrow pierced. Maybe Race was making judgments, but he was guessing that was the kid who had been in juvie. He wasn't the oldest boy. Race would guess him to be 3rd or 4th in birth order. Race grabbed Penny's hand, and they walked toward the children. Ethan closed the door and stepped back and to the side, out of the way. One of the ladies walked around the children with her hand out.
I am Darlene Biddle.
She held her hand first to Penny and then to Race.
These are the Barclay children. Let me introduce you, although we don't expect you to remember everything all at once, so no pressure.
Her tone was very businesslike, and Race suspected it was that way on purpose. Probably there were a lot of foster parent matchups like this that didn't work out. She'd need some kind of shield to protect her heart.
This is the oldest, Ruby. She's 17.
Ruby gave a sweet smile, although her eyes were guarded, and Race figured she'd seen more heartache since her parents died than she had for her entire life. She gave the appearance of someone who had been sheltered. Movement out of the corner of his eye caught Race's attention, and he looked over to see Ethan shifting with his eyes caught on Ruby. Race recognized that look all too well. It was exactly the way he looked when he looked at Penny.
Next, we have Denver, who is 16.
Darlene pointed to a long, skinny boy that was taller than Ruby and who held the hand of what Race guessed to be the youngest girl. Sir, ma'am, he said. His voice held confidence, and he looked Race right in the eye. Race liked him immediately.
Next, we have West, who is 14, and Shane, who is 13.
Both of those boys said hi with almost as much confidence as the oldest brother, but still, Race could see the uncertainty in their eyes. Especially West, who had the shaved head with the hair dangling down and the skull and crossbones dangling in his ear. Race could be wrong, but he'd bet the jewelry was armor. Obviously, he had some bad experiences since his parents passed away.
And the last 2 girls are Journey and Blakely.
She indicated a little girl with long blonde pigtails, and then the one that was holding Denver's hand, who had shorter and darker hair. Neither one of those two said hi, and Blakely slid half behind Denver, hiding.
Children, this is Penny and Race. They will be married on Saturday, as you know. And if things work out today, we will place you in their home next week on a temporary basis, probationary basis. We'll see how things go from there.
She clasped her hands together and nodded at the other woman.
We'll step away and give you guys some privacy to get to know each other.
If Race had speculated as to what he'd feel when faced with 6 children who might become his, or would at least live in his home, he might have said, overwhelmed. But looking at the faces in front of him, he just felt peace, sure that this was exactly what the Lord would have for him, however it worked out. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.